Hi, and welcome to a very special episode of Music Ed Tech Talk. Today, Dorico, the professional scoring desktop application, is out for iPad. And with me today is their product marketing manager, Daniel Spreadbury, here to talk all about this release, everything that went into making it, all of the details, some guidance for music teachers to get started, as well as some very nerdy technical details of why certain things work in the way that they do or don't. And I had a blast. So here's the conversation. Enjoy it. Do you want to be the person who shares the purpose for our call today?
Sure. So the reason that we're chatting today, and the reason that I'm talking to you just at the beginning of the week in which we're making this big announcement, is that over the last, I guess we really started we officially got the go-ahead in November of 2020, so less than a year ago, really only kind of 7 months ago, we started working on a brand new version of Dorico for the iPad. And that is what we're releasing this week on Wednesday, which is pretty cool and has been a tremendous amount of work. But we're also incredibly excited and very proud of what we've managed to build together over this year.
Yeah, if you're listening to this, it's out, so go download it.
Sure, it's free as well. Go grab it from the App Store.
Yeah,
it's free.
It's free, and we'll get into that in a moment. Yeah, so the last time you were on, which we were before we got cut off, we were talking was about 4 years ago, back in 2017, and we talked a lot about Dorico and your personal journey to everything from your journey to the kind of working on the project to like some of the basic features. I mean, I am would refer anyone who wants to get that background to go back and listen to that. I'll link it in the show notes today. I'll just warn you though, I've changed the name of the show since then, so you're going to be like, whoa, is this the same show? It is. I just changed the name. Robbie Burns and Friends didn't seem like it was telling people that much about what dominantly was becoming this subject of conversation, which was things adjacent to music teaching or technology. So anyway, I would recommend anyone who wants a more thorough background on this subject, certainly to go back and listen to that. But yeah, I just want to say personally how excited I am. I think I asked you, I don't remember if it was actually it made it into the recording of the episode, but I know when we spoke, I asked you that long ago, I asked you about this, being someone who since then and still is very much, I was trying to figure out if I should call myself an iPad enthusiast or an iPad optimist, but whatever kind of person you are, where you like want a little bit more from it always than like Apple and maybe like software developers are giving you, but it also has this like great potential, but you always are feeling a little bit like it's one step away from being realized. And so to have a tool so integral to the life of a musician, a teacher, of course, a composer, available on mobile is super exciting. It's, I'm like really, really stoked for it. So thank you to you and your team for doing this, for prioritizing this.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're very welcome. And, it's something that we literally wanted to do right from the very beginning. When we joined Steinberg, we thought, even though, this was 2012, beginning of 2013, and obviously iPads were still relatively new then, they'd come out in 2010, I think. And, but it was pretty clear that, Apple were making a big bet on the iPad, and that this was going to be, it was already obviously, selling tens of millions of units a year, and it was going to be a big category. But, we always thought back then that we would end up having to build a totally different app between the desktop and the iPad. At that stage, we hadn't even settled on Qt or Qt, the application framework that we build Dorico with. And so, the idea was, well, we'll build our sort of core libraries, the core notation engine and all the rest of it. We'll build that in a very platform agnostic way, and then hope that one way or another we can then build different apps for desktop and for the iPad in due course. But as the rubber hit the road and we had to focus on actually shipping Dorico for Mac and Windows, that kind of ambition went a little bit by the wayside. But I think now that you see Dorico on the iPad, and you can see that it really doesn't look very dissimilar to Dorico on the desktop, hopefully you can see that that was always part of our thinking, basically, in terms of how the app is laid out, how the UI, the proportions of the UI, the approach to try and keep everything in a single window. That's obviously great for laptop users, which was also something that we were always been very keen on targeting, that you should be able to do all of your Dorico work on just one screen. And then, of course, that it should grow gracefully to accommodate more screens and more devices if you have them. But, that core single screen experience, we have, we always had the iPad or, a touch first device, at least, whether it was a Windows One or an iPad, in mind. And so I think now that you see the app, hopefully, because it looks and feels like Dorico, and hopefully that still looks and feels reasonably, appropriate to the platform.
Well, I'll say that when I first started poking around, I was just immediately sort of like, I don't know, just like, I guess like very pleasantly surprised at how much the same it is. I mean, on the one hand, I know that like the iPad, when it was originally conceived and sort of like marketed to the public, the ability to sort of like totally transform this giant touch surface into anything sort of lent itself towards very, very different kinds of applications. But over time, Apple has maybe like refined or redefined, or I guess just sort of made the iPad a much more modular device that is capable of, for some, doing a lot of the same kinds of interactions that like a desktop or a laptop computer can do. So I mean, when I opened Dorico for iPad for the first time, I actually felt very, very at home as a Mac user of the software. A lot of things, I mean, I know that some things, we'll get into this, some of the things have been redesigned for some extra kinds of touch interactions, but I felt pretty immediately, especially with a Magic Keyboard connected to it, that I was able to just jump right in and start working in the same way. So I don't know. I mean, do you feel like this changed over time, like as Apple kind of like repositioned and remarketed the iPad as this, put Pro in the title and added, like trackpad support and some of these other features? Did this change the direction of what you all wanted to do with the software?
No, I think really it was more like we realised that a whole bunch of stuff had happened that made it feasible to think about, so when we first started experimenting with building stuff that you could actually use on the iPad, and we're talking several years ago now, we had a very, very rough and ready kind of score viewer app years ago. I don't know how many years ago now. 4 years ago. We got one of the first generation iPad Pros, so I guess it was something like 4 or 5 years ago. And Graham, one of our developers, kind of built this very simple thing where we would draw the score on the iPad, and you couldn't really do anything else with it. And it was the main worry we had then was Dorico is a very RAM intensive app. The representation of the score in memory is pretty big, and so that was always our worry, was like, well, these iPads, they've got like 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabytes of RAM, and even before you put sounds in, Dorico and a decent sized score can be over 1 gigabyte of RAM while it's running. And so that was always something we were thinking about. And then of course the other thing was that the Qt application framework that Dorico is built on has supported iOS for for quite a while, but not to a hugely sophisticated kind of level of maturity. And of course the Qt is a massive framework. It does all sorts of stuff, and it actually has two completely different UI frameworks built into it. There's the old widgets one, which is actually what most of Dorico for desktop has been built on, and then there's this newer one called Qt Quick, which is a markup language called QML, which is sort of a declarative thing, a bit like Swift UI and so on, which is much more mature these days and has been kind of really designed for mobile devices, but wasn't really suitable for desktop devices. And so there's been this big convergence over the last few years of iPads having these much, much, much more powerful processors, more RAM, Qt maturing to the point where it's possible to build, desktop level UI with QML, and also for widgets to even work on iOS. And so all of these came together. And then the question became, in the middle of last year, after we finished 3.5, okay, so we've always thought that we were going to need to take our core libraries and build a totally different application around them. What if we flip that question on its head now? And of course, this is just before WWDC last year, and we were all pretty much suspecting that Apple are going to announce this transition to ARM processors, basically using the same processors using the iPads in the Macs. And if that's good enough, then that means the iPads are already strong enough to run Dorico. So instead of thinking about building something else up from the core, why don't we see what we actually have to take away from the whole app that we already have to build something that will work on the iPad? And turning the question around in that way was actually that was the crucial the crucial change. Graham, again, same developer who'd done the original kind of sort of mock-up of the score reader app, he basically started hacking bits of Dorico out until we had something that ran. And within a few weeks, we had something very rough and ready. No playback, no printing, because Qt doesn't support printing on iOS. We've had to implement that ourselves. But we had something that looked like a really ugly version of Dorico for the iPad, complete with system menu bar across the top of the screen. But it worked, and it showed us that this was something that was going to be feasible.
So certainly developments in Apple's positioning of their software and hardware strategy, but not necessarily like the Magic Keyboard and the mouse inputs. But kind of, I mean, I feel like this is something that I want to, again, I keep hinting at things I want to talk about, but I'll just throw this out there for later discussion. Well, I mean, it's one of these things where it's like, for me, like I've been thinking a lot lately about cross-platform software as it relates to Apple's sort of like, their greater strategy of what they want to do. And you mentioned the M1. I mean, this is obviously that's a super interesting kind of way to understand, your process for how, Dorico can now exist on the iPad. But, Apple has released some other technologies that sort of like can go the other way. I recently it's been around since the fall, but I only just recently got around to publishing a blog post about it. But one of my most used iPad apps is Fourscore. And that this past year got a Mac app, and it is using Apple's Catalyst technology, which is what you take iPad code and you run. So I think in most or all cases you use UIKit, which is the kind of the framework for iOS development. And yeah, you basically can just like as a developer make some tweaks or not. I think you can just check a box and just have your pure iOS. Your iPad app kind of just run on the Mac. But yeah, so Fourscore is like this example of touch first. Like it's an example of an app that I feel like when the iPad was originally announced, it like took advantage of all the things that immediately made sense about like why would you want this like touch surface? Like it's got directly tapping the screen makes a lot of sense. Obviously, like this thin slab of glass form factor makes a lot of sense for throwing on a music stand or in a bag or taking to a gig. Apple Pencil, making annotations smoother and more natural. Like there's just a lot of things that are very, it's one of these apps that makes the iPad this kind of an essential and necessary tool for me. And so when it came to the Mac, it was like all of a sudden I was like, wow, this is like not necessarily the platform where I feel like its, strengths are most apparent to me, but it is really, really good to have an indispensable application on all of my platforms, because now I can do things like using the refinement of the macOS keyboard and mouse. I can like more easily add scores into my library, things like this, or I can resize a window more quickly, or I can share it on a Google Meet to my classroom, let them see a score that we're looking at. So this idea of like things becoming cross-platform as an Apple user is super interesting, and I don't know, I kind of want to get a little maybe nerdy about this. I mean, there's like Dorico to me on iPad feels like you're saying, it feels very much like, like its Mac and its Windows counterpart. Like I was immediately able to start, after I got oriented to a couple of extra things on the screen, I was able to immediately just start using the Magic Keyboard to, input notes. I'm kind of like a computer keyboard input user. That's my primary thing, a little bit mouse input. But yeah, I mean, I just was like tapping away, doing the popover menus. I mean, all the stuff that to me as a music educator that I need from Dorico is all there. It feels truly desktop class in a way that sometimes when an app makes the switch from one platform to another, it doesn't always feel that way. But Dorico for iPad does feel that way. That was a long way of going down that rabbit hole, and I'm not done. But that's
I think you're absolutely right, of course. And I think Apple it's interesting because they, for everything they say, when you listen to what they say at their product introductions and their WWDC and so on, they're not interested in converging macOS and iPadOS, but at the same time they're building technologies that allow you to build at least things that are predominantly share a common experience across all of those platforms. And certainly my impression of what they're going to be introducing with iOS 15 and with macOS Monterey this year is that all of the same features are on both platforms, and they may be the way they actually kind of enacted across the platforms is different, they're all there, and they work, pretty seamlessly across those platforms if they live up to the promise and the demonstrations. I haven't tried any of the betas yet, so I don't know, but that's really, I think, really interesting. But I think that it's also clear that they are still going to have somewhat different experiences on each platform, even though the features are the same. And I think we're sort of trying to look at Dorico in the same way. And I think what's interesting is that now we have Dorico for iPad, it's obviously going to influence every single decision we make for the future development of Dorico, because we build Dorico for iPad from the same code as Dorico for macOS and Windows on a nightly build, and every time we add something to Dorico for the desktop, it's going to be there in the iPad version. So what does that mean? Does it need a different UI? Does it need to be added somewhere else? Does it need to be removed because it isn't going to work for whatever reason, or it doesn't belong in the product tiers that we have, and so on? And so what I think we will see, and certainly, the development of the iPad version this year and adopting some new technologies that I think are going to be pivotal to our ongoing development of Dorico across all platforms, it's completely changed, or at least at the very least has added a whole new dimension to the way that we think about planning the app and developing the app. And I think that, going forward, that the whole idea will be that we will try to make the experience of using Dorico across the three platforms that we run on, macOS, Windows, and iPadOS. We'll try to make that as consistent and similar as we can, while still, playing to the strengths of each platform as best we can.
Yeah, one of the things I like the most about the iPad version, I'm pretty sure this is something that maybe is coming to a future Mac release of Dorico. It's this key editor on the iPad. It's something I really like, and I don't know if I'm describing it the same way that you all do internally, but to me, it's almost like anyone who's used the MIDI, like edited MIDI using a piano roll editor and a digital audio workstation. It sort of like takes one of the instruments in the score and allows you to edit it in a similar interface, but by touch. Is that a fair explanation of this?
Absolutely. So obviously Dorico has had a kind of piano roll editor and various kinds of MIDI editing tools in play mode, but the big problem with having them in play mode is they're very divorced from the notation. And, I don't know about you, I personally don't read piano roll notation very well. I know there are musicians out there who absolutely can see chord shapes and see major and minor triads and see other voicings and so on really, really easily, and melody shapes as well, by reading the piano roll. I find that difficult myself, and I think probably a lot of notation first users do. And so the idea with the key editor really was to take that power that's currently shut away in play mode in the desktop version of Dorico and make it available everywhere, so that, for example, in write mode, it would, as you make a selection in the music, it's going to then bring that system of music for that instrument into the key editor, and it basically they're synchronized effectively. The view between the key editor and the main regular staff notation or tablature, whatever you're looking at, is synchronized. And so in that way, one of the things that we hear a lot from our users on the desktop is that when they're trying to do tweaking of playback, they want to do this or that with their virtual instruments. It's that discontinuity between the notation that they're thinking about and the separate place they have to go and then find their place again and find the right track and the right lane and so on. That's a real workflow killer. And particularly on the iPad, of course, when you've really only got one display, we wanted to be able to make it kind of as efficient as possible. And so certainly, this kind of migration of those play mode tools into what we're now borrowing the term from Cubase, the lower zone, where now things like the properties panel, all of the on-screen instruments, the key editor, and so on are all located. That's something that we're definitely going to introduce in the desktop version, because it just makes sense. It doesn't matter that it happens to be on the iPad that we've managed to do it first. It's just that is really what actually makes sense for that tool. It probably should always have been available in write mode, and we were probably a bit wrong-headed to have tried to separate them. I think that the separation that Dorico has between write mode and engrave mode is still absolutely right, but I think that that trying to say that the playback side of things isn't necessarily part of the writing process is maybe not quite such a clear-cut distinction. And so bringing the tools from play mode into write mode in the iPad version, and then eventually in the next desktop version, I think that's and obviously on the desktop you've got, even though on the iPad we have access to audio units and so on, which does allow you a greater kind of sonic palette to work with, and you've got the ability to do insert effects and all this stuff. So if you want to do kind of detailed tweaking and shaping of the performance, the tools are there. But obviously it's really on the desktop where users have, big sample libraries and lots of, chains of tools they're using together that are common with their DAWs or whatever. And so I think that, yes, you see it in the iPad version, and it's pretty powerful and really makes a lot of sense. And I think it's going to make even more sense when that comes to the desktop version in the next version.
Yeah, I like it a lot. I like how it just pops right up on bottom, which is really how most digital audio workstations display the piano roll, kind of on the bottom of the screen with everything else. And there's times where, moving a note, I just kind of want to like directly manipulate it, but it doesn't really make sense to do it on the staff because I'm not sure quite how that would be implemented. But to just take one of these little colorful rectangles and just move it to the right or to the left or up or down, and then see the note in the score also change is really, really nice.
Yeah, I mean, we debated long and hard about the way that you should interact with the music directly with your finger. Obviously, in Dorico on the desktop, you can't drag notes up and down with the mouse. That's something that, occasionally, so not as often as you would think, I think, actually, considering that, as far as I know, pretty much every other music notation program does have that feature, and we sort of stubbornly don't have it in Dorico. And we probably will add it in the fullness of time, particularly as we're trying to bring Dorico closer to Cubase, which is another sort of long-term project of ours. And obviously in Cubase, that's in any editor, whether it's the key editor or the score editor or whatever, dragging things up and down with the mouse is absolutely sort of table stake stuff. You just expect to be able to do it, but it's not so obvious on the iPad anyway, because unless you're going to be zoomed in so close that you can only see like one bar of music and maybe not even the whole height of the stave once you've got a panel showing or something, dragging a note with your big fat finger isn't great. Obviously you can drag it with a pencil if you've got one. That's a different thing. But I think the other thing that we quickly discovered is that the lack of the ability to hover over anything on the iPad, at least using your finger, means that you have to rethink a lot of those core interactions anyway. Which is why, for example, when you're editing notes, as you say, you can either do it in the key editor, where you can, you generally speaking, you've got a rectangle that's a bit bigger than your finger, so you can see it, and you also get a nice crosshair as you're dragging the note, and you can drag it up and down, or you can drag it rhythmically left and right as well, and Dorico will do that just like a sequencer would. But also in the staff, we ended up then with a separate overlay that gives you those tools so that you can decide whether you want to transpose up or down by an octave and by a semitone or a half step or whatever. And that was really, again, obviously when we developed Dorico for the desktop, and you've already mentioned it a couple of times yourself, that if you have a keyboard that you can plug into your iPad, you can basically use all those same keyboard shortcuts that you're familiar with from using Dorico on your desktop computer. You can use all of those on the iPad as well. But it was very important to us that you could literally just sling your iPad in your bag without anything else, and you could still, use Dorico in the way that you've become accustomed to it. And so we end up with these sort of contextual tools that appear on the screen that allow you to move notes either in rhythm or in pitch and so on. And they're separate from the notes, so that you're not obscuring the thing that you're actually trying to edit with your finger, which is why there's the so-called mouse input mode of Dorico, where you kind of tap a note in the panel and then you tap in the score. That mode doesn't exist in Dorico for iPad, because we want to make sure that you can always see the music, and so that's why we have these nice on-screen multi-touch instruments like the keyboard and the fretboard and the drum pads, so that you can still have a very intuitive, musically intuitive way of determining the pitch, whether you're a keyboard player or a guitar player, whatever, but without having to directly interact with the music with your finger, because that's going to then obscure the musical context that you need to actually write the music in the first place.
Right, exactly, yeah. And speaking of things that are both integrated onto the bottom of write mode, but that are also things you can interact with by touch, there's also a mixer down there now, which I also really appreciate. That's super handy.
Yeah, the mixer is, I think the mixer, it's fair to say, in Dorico, on the desktop is kind of, it's been a bit neglected, to be honest. Obviously, it's quite powerful in as much as it exposes a decent amount of the functionality of the Cubase audio engine that Dorico on the desktop uses as its kind of audio and playback engine. But it's really not very pretty to look at. It's not very performant. It's quite laggy as you drag the faders around, and it was important to us that obviously we wanted to have something. I mean, we're very lucky at Steinberg that Cubasis exists. Lucky in a number of counts, because Cubasis obviously is also how we've got an audio engine for the iPad version of Dorico, because we're using the engine from Cubasis, just like we use the engine from Cubase on the desktop. We use the engine from the iPad DAW on the iPad, and Cubasis on the iPad is a really beautiful app and really wonderfully touch first designed as well. And we were very impressed with the mixer in Cubasis, and how it's really, really nicely designed for touch. And so it was something that we really wanted to kind of include in Dorico. And, obviously we had to rebuild all of these things from scratch. We couldn't just bring them over from Cubasis. But we know that, the team Cubasis has been around for the better part of 10 years. It's quite a mature app by now. And the interactions that they've designed in there are really excellent. And so, we felt we're very lucky to be able to kind of draw inspiration and even, work in collaboration with the team who work on Cubasis to bring some of those things into Dorico for iPad. And I think, again, it's going to be excellent when we have that mixer. It'll have to have some more features added to it for Big Dorico on the desktop, in terms of, additional effects and routing and so on, and different types of faders. But you can see, again, this is all bringing Dorico towards, it's kind of an evolution of very much the original vision that we've had for it, but we're refining it as we go. And I think that's been one of the most fun things about working on the iPad version, is the challenge of squeezing Dorico into a single display environment in a way that still really makes a lot of sense, and that gives us things that we can translate back to the desktop version as well. Right.
So some of these new parts of the UI, like the fretboard, the piano, the mixer, the key editor. So these things, I guess it's from, just to sort of synthesize what I'm putting together here, it sounds like some of those are things that are going to make their way to the desktop version. And then long term, these sort of feature sets are going to be more in sidestep with each other. Maybe is it safe to say that iPad releases might coincide with desktop future releases down the road?
Yeah, I think sort of to the extent that we can make sure that we get through app review and all those things kind of on the same kind of time frame, and it might be that certain features might need a bit of extra time on the iPad version because we've got to do a different, because it won't always be possible to use the same UI approach, for example, for new features as we add them and this kind of thing. But absolutely, the plan is that we, as I said a little bit earlier on, we now see Dorico as being an app that we're developing on 3 platforms, on Windows, on macOS, and on iPad OS. And so you can absolutely expect that as we continue to develop Big Dorico on the desktop, the iPad version will follow either completely in step or very close behind it. That's absolutely our intention.
Right. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about what makes iPad apps and what makes desktop apps. But first, I feel like I want to just hit some some stats or some facts about this release, and then sort of connect them to one of the things that's changed since we last spoke is there are more versions of Dorico than there were back then. And I feel like my audience, having so many music teachers, I want to highlight how many different versions there are, because a lot of my, especially as our districts, many districts over the world have embraced some of these student-facing cloud tools, things like Noteflight, Flat.io. Some of my teaching colleagues, I think, have sort of, in frustration with some of the other desktop score apps available, have sort of just moved to these tools that are good enough for them but have their own sets of limitations. For me personally, when I'm making worksheets, composing, reconstructing missing parts from my library, I just don't feel fast enough or efficient enough in web-based software. But what a lot of music teachers don't know is that there's actually a free desktop version of Dorico. There's actually 3 versions. So I'm wondering, can we cover those and then maybe talk about how the paid and unpaid version of the iPad app sort of relates to those 3 desktop versions.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. So yes, you're absolutely right. So around it was January of was it 2020? Was it 2019? Who knows? I can't even tell anymore. But a while ago, we introduced Dorico SE, which is a totally free version of Dorico that you can just go and download from our website, and it has got pretty much all of the main features of Dorico. It's obviously missing engrave mode. It's missing some of the advanced playback sounds that come with the Pro version, and crucially, I think the most significant limitation is it's you can only write for projects of up to 2 players. But in all other respects, all of the same, so if you're an instrumental teacher and you're doing exercises for your, solo student kids, this kind of thing, it absolutely probably has everything you need, because even some of the most advanced features of Dorico, like its really beautiful fingering tools or its harp pedaling tools or whatever it might be, those features are all included in Dorico SE. The only limitation really is that you don't have all the page layout tools in engrave mode, and you can't write for big ensembles. And then so that one's free. Then the next version is Dorico Elements, which if you're an educator you can buy for about $65, so it's really not very expensive. And if you're buying it for your school, if you need to buy a bunch of copies, if you're buying 5 or more copies, it's basically, I think it might be $35 or $40 if you're buying 5 copies, so it's really pretty inexpensive. That again has basically the same features as Dorico SE, but you can write for ensembles of up to 12 players. So that's obviously, smaller school ensembles or smaller chamber ensembles, not quite band and orchestra yet, but choral work, totally doable in there. And then of course there's Dorico Pro, which is which was originally called Dorico back in version 1, but we introduced Dorico Pro in Dorico 2, which is when Dorico Elements came out, and then Dorico SE came out during Dorico 3's lifetime. I think it came out with Dorico 3.1. So we kind of have this family of products now, and all of them that we sell for money have educational pricing, and teachers can buy. Even Dorico Pro, you can buy for, even if you have no other notation software, you can buy it for $270, I think. And if you have Sibelius or Finale, any version, doesn't matter, old or new, you can buy it for another, I don't know, nearly $100 less than that, something like $150, $160, something like that. So, and of course, if you're buying multiple copies for your district, it's even cheaper. It's basically $100 a seat for Dorico Pro. And if you've got existing Sibelius licenses, it can be even less. So we've always certainly tried to make Dorico as available as possible to music educators. It's a really, obviously it's a huge, hugely important part of our user base, because, it's through instructors and educators that we're going to get the next generation of composers and performers and so on, and we would obviously love for them to be using our tools. That will be good for us in the long run. So we've always had quite generous price breaks for our software, and Dorico for iPad kind of slots in functionally in much the same way. Obviously the big challenge with an iPad app is that Apple doesn't provide you with a wide variety of business models. You can have a paid app, but then you can't have any updates or upgrades, or you can have a free app and you can have a sort of a freemium model where you can charge for consumables or in-app purchases to add bits and bobs and so on. And so we decided that what would make the most sense for Dorico would be to have the main Dorico iPad app be like Dorico SE, so that's completely free. So anybody can go to the App Store and download Dorico for iPad, and you get pretty much the same feature set as Dorico SE, but of course with all the nice things that we've been talking about, like the on-screen keyboard, the fretboard, the drum pads, the mixer, the key editor. All of those things are all nicely integrated, and you get this really lovely kind of user experience. And if you sign in with your Steinberg ID, which we do basically in the hopes that you might agree to let us send you the odd marketing email from time to time, then if you just sign in once with your username and password, then we will then double the number of players that you can write with from 2 to 4 without you having to spend any money. And then if you really want to get the most out of the iPad version in its current form, then you can basically subscribe either on a monthly or an annual basis. And it's basically $4 a month or $40 a year, so that's basically 12 months for the price of 10, and that gets you all of the features of Dorico Elements, Plus, actually, because Dorico Elements on the desktop doesn't contain engrave mode at all, whereas on the iPad version it includes the graphical editing bit in engrave mode, so you can make detailed tweaks to all the notations, and it includes the notation options dialog, where you can change things like how rhythms are represented and what the accidental rules are, and so on. And so the idea is that, no matter what kind of, whether you're paid or free or whatever, you're always going to get the updates to the base app free of charge, just like with Dorico SE on the desktop. When Dorico 4 comes out eventually, Dorico SE will get some of the Dorico 4 features completely for free, and that will also be true on the iPad version. But of course, we'll also try to find ways of, over time, adding more value to customers who choose to subscribe. But you can hop on and off the subscription, anytime. And the other thing that I think is worth saying, and this is true on the desktop versions as well, is that all of these lower versions of Dorico, the ones that are limited to either 12 players or 4 players or 2 players, they can all open files made in any version of Dorico. So you can open even a huge orchestral score with 80 staves in the iPad version, and you can play it back. It won't sound great, but you can play it back, and you can print it, and you can look at the parts, and you can even use the new read view that we've put in there that allows you to kind of, like a very, very low rent version of FourScore, basically, that allows you to look at a particular score or part and have it in a view that's sort of distraction free, and you can tap the screen to turn the pages and so on. So it's, and the idea is, obviously, what we hope is that not only will people who are already using Dorico on the desktop will choose to start using the iPad version, lots of people who use Dorico on the desktop are already using another notation app on the iPad, whether it's Notion or StaffPad or Symphony Pro, whatever it might be. So obviously what we would love to see is some of those people starting to use Dorico on all of their devices, but also we hope that it will bring people into Dorico for the first time who don't use it on the desktop, and they'll start using it on the iPad, and then maybe they'll want to be able to also add a desktop version to their toolbox as well. So hopefully we're kind of addressing, as far as we can, the whole sort of world of musicians who might have an interest in notation software, and providing something at every price point for them, basically.
Sure, yeah. There is definitely a kind of user who just the iPad fits into their life in this kind of way, like someone who might not need to be doing a whole lot professionally. Maybe they just want to they're learning piano and they want to just have some kind of environment to just get some ideas down. I mean, there's definitely a scenario where I can see an iPad first user being all about this. But even for teachers, I tell teachers this all the time, for most of the teachers who I know who are not really super into this kind of software but need it to make worksheets or something, when I see them using literally any other software, I have to tell them, I'm like, you could, the free version of Dorico can do what you're doing, but with some time and with learning some of the keyboard commands and the popovers and things, you can get real fast and speedy with it. And then I tell this to educators who maybe want to take that next step too. Even though I'm a Dorico Pro user, I did some thinking about this over the past week as I was using the iPad version. I really do 90% of the time just live within the features of Elements. Things that are on the iPad that are not on that Pro version on the desktop, some of the the engraving features, the print menu, even some of the playback stuff are things that I'm just a little bit personally less interactive with. I wouldn't consider myself a beginner in Dorico, but I'm definitely not a professional composer or a power user. So I actually, for me, and this might be weird, I don't know how many people tell you this feedback, but having things a whole mode dedicated to print, for me to have just a couple of options in a share sheet is actually preferred. It's actually a little, it helps me to kind of get in and out of it faster, because I don't do a whole lot with the engrave mode, but it's also I like to not feel limited when I do need that. But for most teachers, I just think the free version or the Elements are good, and this iPad version is just going to be such a nice complement to that.
Yeah, well, I hope that is true, and obviously it's very difficult trying to decide what goes in at each level in the because it's a balancing act, of course. You want to provide really good value for money when somebody is spending money with you, but at the same time, obviously we do want to try to make Dorico Pro attractive enough in its own right that that people gravitate to it, and we hope that that most music educators, maybe they will be comfortable with Elements, and to be honest, that would be totally fine with us, because I think that the strengths of Dorico are not always necessarily in those high end. I mean, those high end engraving features, they've got to be there, because if you're going to do real publication work, you need them. But I think that if we're talking about wanting to do, a quick transposition of an ensemble piece, or an exercise for a student, or a quick choral piece for next week's assembly, or whatever it might be, the whole point with Dorico is that you just type the notes in and everything else is taken care of for you. And that isn't true with pretty much any other notation program that somebody might be using, whether it's in the browser or whether it's a desktop piece of software. You're always going to have to spend a load of time moving things around and fixing things up. And we've really tried to make it so that, in Dorico, you just type the music in and then you print it out. And so I hope that will be, a whole new load of musicians will see that really is true with the new iPad version. And so even though if you have a subscription, you've got access to some of those graphical tools, I hope that for the most part, people won't even need them, and really the reason to upgrade to the subscription is because you just want to write for a bigger ensemble. We'll see what happens. It's going to be very interesting. Even though we've had Cubasis in the App Store for many years now, Cubasis, kind of works in the closest way we can to the way we sell boxed software, what used to be boxed software, in as much as there's an app called Cubasis, and there's another app called Cubasis 2, and there's another app called Cubasis 3, and if you want to move from one to the other, you have to buy that, and there's certain things you can do with bundles to try and bring them together to make the combined price a bit cheaper and so on. But but basically that one is done that way, where each couple of years a brand new version comes out and so on. But really with Dorico for the iPad, we're trying to kind of just make it's just Dorico, it's just there, it has these features. If you want to subscribe, you can. If you don't want to, you don't need to, and it will just evolve as the software kind of rolls along. And hopefully that will mean that it will, like you say, become sort of part of people's. It just fits into their musical life in the way that they will find useful.
Sure. Yeah, speaking of pricing, and I think this is maybe two questions, but I'm going to phrase it like one, and then you can just go at it however you want. So I guess part one of the question is did you investigate other pricing models for the iPad? And then I guess part two is like, now that iPad has, you've decided to go with a subscription-based pricing, like have you considered like doing sort of like doing like an account-based thing where like you charge like more for a subscription and then someone gets the desktop and the iPad app, or they get it like on Windows and Mac and on iPad everywhere? Like are these things that are sort of bouncing around? Or comment only to the extent that you are able, of course.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're always thinking about all of these things, because software business doesn't stand still, and people who follow Steinberg will know that we have surveyed our customers several times over the years about the idea of subscriptions, and on the whole, customers are pretty hostile to them, or at least they certainly say that they are, and of course it's a big risk to start doing a subscription if your customers tell you they don't really want you to, and I think we can look at other software even in the field, and even in our little niche, where companies have pressed ahead with subscription offerings that have been done kind of at the protest of users who haven't necessarily embraced it as much as they would like, or they haven't willingly embraced it. And so that's certainly it's certainly a tricky one, and I think that if in the future Steinberg does add a subscription offering to its desktop software, it would always be done as an alternative to buying a perpetual license rather than replacing buying a perpetual license. And I think the thing is that particularly Cubase, for example, which has been around for 32 years now, I think, a very long time, there are customers who have paid thousands of euros to Steinberg over the years, upgrading Cubase from the Atari ST to the PC to the Mac to Cubase SX to Cubase, VST, blah blah blah, and on and on and on, and onto Cubase 11, where we are now. And those customers are rightly going to feel a bit shortchanged if suddenly they have to start paying monthly for their software, So, but at the same time, there are also, for example, young students coming out of university for whom even $300, it's an enormous amount of money to be spending on software, and they don't have that money. And at the moment, those customers are shut out of using our Cubase Pro tool on the desktop, or probably also Dorico Pro on the desktop, and that's a shame. So I think that, you know, the way forward there is going to have to involve, if we do introduce subscription pricing, and I should make clear that there are absolutely no concrete plans to do this. You know, it's not something we're actively pursuing, but I think from the discussions that I've had with my colleagues at Steinberg, if we pursue that in the future, it will be done in such a way that it doesn't, or at least as far as we possibly can, doesn't diminish the investment of our existing long-time customers, while opening the door to customers for whom, you know, that investment is just too great for them to make in one go. So I think that, you know, really when it comes to the iPad version specifically, it was a case of, you know, we've now got the experience of having, as I mentioned, Cubasis is our sort of primary app. We have a whole bunch of apps. Steinberg has all sorts of cool apps on the App Store, but Cubasis is the one that, you know, that is the big one. And, you know, certainly through the years, obviously it was introduced before some of the in-app purchase options were available, for example, back when it came in 2012. So there's been an evolution of the App Store to a certain extent, but not to the point where any business model you might want to pursue for selling software is available. Apple clearly have a preferred way for you to go. And so part of the calculus that we're making is, you know, what's going to be the thing that's going to be most in line with what other developers on the platform are doing, you know. And I think that free is obviously a very attractive price point for somebody to try the software, which is tricky otherwise. And, you know, all of the other scoring apps that are significant, I would say, on the platform, all of them have an upfront purchase price, you know, either $15, or in the case of StaffPad, excuse me, it's $80. And so, you know, that's, even that for an iPad app is a reasonable investment to ask a user to make. So, you know, we're trying to balance making the software as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, while also still leaving the door for us to actually recoup some of the money that we've spent on it. Because obviously having the majority of our team working for the better part of, you know, certainly all of this year and a little bit of at the end of last year on this new app, you know, that comes not necessarily with a great financial cost any more than just Steinberg paying us to do our jobs, but it's an opportunity cost. All the time that we spend working on the iPad version, we're not working on something else. And so, you know, in the end, we need to have some revenue. It's got to come from somewhere. Otherwise, you know, what are we doing here? So it's a balancing act. And I think, you know, I would love to think that in the future we can have some kind of, you know, payment that you make somewhere. Maybe you make it on your iPad and it gives you access to the desktop version or something. I would love to see that, but that isn't something that we're actively working on.
Got it. Cool. All right. Well, you know, the payment, the Apple focus on in-app purchase, in combination with some things you mentioned earlier about, you know, not offering the cross-grade, the upgrade pricing, education licenses, any of that stuff. This to me, and I'm curious your opinion on this. This more than RAM or even like the recent trackpad support or any of the other reasons even iPad OS itself, like more than any of the other reasons why you might say that an iPad is not a quote professional device. It seems like some App Store policies and, you know, some of the ways that it's inflexible to developers, like the people working at Steinberg, and the kind of, like, you know, very, very specific professional software that you and other people in other industries are making. It just seems like Apple is kind of like, their policies are hostile to that kind of stuff developing, and it's sort of like hindered a little bit of that development. I mean, was that one of the reasons why? It sounds like not. It just sounds like you were focused on other things, and now was just the time for the iPad. But do you feel like that's a reason why we don't have more professional software on that? And I hate the word professional is tough. Like, email is a professional tool. Like, I can do email great on my iPad, but sure. I think we both have a shared understanding of there being all sorts of, like, really tiny corners of different industries all over the world where there's great desktop software and not great iPad counterparts to it.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I'm not sure it's necessarily Apple's policies so much as that, you know, I think the App Store in general, you know, there's a huge explosion of supercomputers in everybody's pockets and this massive audience of people now for new apps and so on. And then the fact that it's basically the change in the way that software is valued, I think, is the big obstacle. It's not so much Apple's policies as the way that the combination of these super powerful devices with a limitless array of software that you can get for very little money or for no money, it's that sort of has completely changed the average person's perception of what software is worth. But unfortunately, despite advances in development, tools and methodologies and so on, software hasn't got commensurately cheaper to make.
Right.
Right. So obviously in the end, any good that has no physical presence, the law of economics says that, the price you can charge is related to the marginal cost of another one of the things that you're making, right? The cost of the materials plus the cost of assembling it, plus the cost of shipping it, etc., etc., etc. And of course, most of those costs, such as they are in the world of digital bits and bobs, are covered by Apple. That's what you pay your 30% or your 15% if you're lucky enough to qualify for that. That's what you're paying to Apple. They are managing all of those marginal costs, distribution, hosting, payment provision, etc., etc., etc. But the thing is that everything that you have to do to get to the point where you could submit that app to Apple so that they can do that for you, all of that still costs more or less the same as it did 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago, because apps are so much more sophisticated now and software needs to do so much more and needs to do so much more for the user and needs to look better and sound better and run faster and all the rest of it. So I think that the fundamental reason is probably that, at the moment it's still possible, not easy, but possible to make a living selling so-called professional apps on the desktop systems, and it's not quite so clear that you could do that purely on the iPad, not in every niche, let's put it that way, because the music world, people who want to create music on their devices, that's smaller than the people who want to, say, do photography on their devices, who need to write things on their devices, right, using language or whatever. Likewise, the people who want to do visual art is smaller than the number of people who want to do writing or email or whatever, but it's obviously much bigger than the number of people who want to create music. And the people who want to consume music is much bigger than all of those groups. Everybody wants to consume music, but relatively few want to create it. And so when you're looking at a niche of a niche of a niche, and then you're looking at, what those people are willing to pay, or what it appears they're willing to pay, it's very, very hard to say that, the value of software is the thing that has been eroded the most by, sort of ironically, massively making it easier to reach many more people in a very easy way, where they can simply install and uninstall new programs with pretty much a single tap. That's wonderful. It's incredible. It's miraculous. But what it hasn't been great for is the sort of the so-called marginal value of software, what you as a developer can expect to charge for the software that you've built. And, I think it's very telling that Dorico for iPad, in much the same way as Dorico for the desktop, that's free. And Dorico Pro, which has, 20% more features than that, has a ticket price of $500 if you're not eligible for any of the sort of, discounts because you're a cross grader or an educator or whatever. So, that's a massive, massive disparity. And I think that, obviously the hope is that, the audience on the iPad or the iPhone is so big that you don't need to charge as much to each customer in order to make the same money. But the trouble is that when you're in a niche like music creation, I'm not sure that equation works, because, not everybody who's interested in music has the same device, is going to choose your app, etc., etc., etc. So I think that's really the fundamental issue is the erosion of the perception of the value of software. Ironically, I think the true value of software continues to grow exponentially, but the price that consumers are willing to pay for software is kind of going in the opposite direction at a similar speed. Yeah,
interesting. I would love to. I have no evidence other than just anecdotal conversations with people in my worldview, but it would seem to reason that this is maybe slowly changing. I don't know if for software that needs to charge a price tag upwards of $500, but people are certainly more used to the idea of an in-app purchase today, I think, than they were yesterday. And I think it's just because you can't reasonably, or some would say that you can't reasonably live a comfortable life today without Netflix, Disney Plus, and HBO now. Or sorry, did I just call it what's their new thing? HBO Max. People have
HBO
rights
Max,
there because there's
yeah.
more stuff now. But I know that when looking at sort of like the entertainment in media category of software, people are still a little like unwilling to get too much of it in their life, but I think that like slowly our culture is being trained to understand, nope, you pay every month. And I don't know, I've never opposed it too much. I understand that like developers have to eat, but I also like this, I think that like we just replaced our dishwasher like recently, and it had a very, very short 5-year, just over 5-year life, and I know that it was just over 5 years because the warranty was out. And I remember, and I remember telling my wife we subscribe to dishwashers. Like everything
Sure.
is a subscription. If you think about the investment over a long enough period of time. So I don't know. I've always had very little issue conceptualizing this, but it's so interesting to sort of hear you from your perspective sort of comment on that. Because it would I would want to think that Apple is being stingy and they want everyone to just do in-app purchases so they can take your cut and everyone's cut. But I don't know, just interesting to kind of pick in that.
I mean, sure, there's no question that, one of the things that Apple as a business is very focused on is growing what they call their service revenue. And one of the big ways they can make service revenue is by taking chunks of transactions that customers are doing in their ecosystem. So it makes total sense from their point of view. But I also think that, if we can add value to the life of a musician with our software, and we're talking here, Dorico, a subscription to Dorico on the iPad is $4, which is the cost of, here in London, I could maybe get a half decent cup of tea in Starbucks for that, a big one. Certainly wouldn't get a cookie with it or anything like that, and $40 for a year's worth. That's not even one night out of the cinema here in London, right? And yet I'm sure that if I were having to pay for Dorico, luckily I don't. I get to build it, so I don't have to pay for it. But I would certainly be using it enough to say, well, yes, I've got as much use out of it in this year as I would have done from 2 hours with some expensive popcorn at a cinema. And I think that, even people will say, well, my goodness, $4 a month for a notation app. Well, yeah, okay, sure. But if you think about if I paid for Dorico for $250 or something, and then I'm looking at using that for I don't know, well, let's make it easy. Let's say 2 years. It's $10 a month then, right? So, I think like you say, really in real life, we kind of very few things that we pay for are purely one-off purchases that we're never going to have to replace ever again. And if we sort of think about it in terms of amortizing the cost over the period of time that we're actually going to be using it, then you can certainly make the case that everything's subscription. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm no great lover of subscriptions really, but I think that when it comes to coming up with what we hope will be a sustainable business model for this app, so that it actually adds to our overall, revenue, and that means that we can afford to spend more time working on it and thinking about it and making it better. That's the calculation that we've made. It's a total stab in the dark because no other app in our category, at least not one that anybody would use, is using this business model at the moment. Steinberg doesn't use this business model for its other creative tools that are on the App Store. But we really want to kind of move towards this kind of, the app just gets updated. You don't have to worry about whether you've got the most recent version or not. And the features are there, and you can dip in and out of having those extra features as you choose. And we really just want to see how that works. It could be a total failure. I hope it isn't, but it could be. Until we've got some months of users kind of coming on and telling us what they think about it and seeing how they use it. We just won't know.
Yeah, well, I hope it's a success just so that I can keep having it on my iPad.
Sure. Yeah, well, we're certainly not planning on taking it away. I think it would be more like, how do we need to adjust the way that we approach taking it to the market? But what would be lovely is if we get many thousands of people using it, and some of them choose to subscribe, and then that's a really strong signal to us that this is something that it's been worth our investment to date, and it'll repay further investment as well.
Yeah, for sure. This is kind of the thing I've been thinking about the most. As I said earlier, I've been thinking so much about cross-platform software and like what things make an app feel like it belongs natively on a platform. And there's there's like a couple of Dorico for iPad features that specifically you mentioned to me outside of this conversation were not included in this first version, and I kind of wanted to go at them and just sort of like use this as this might get a little nerdy, but I kind of wanted to like use this as a way to educate myself and anyone who's listening who's down for this kind of discussion. Like, what are like some of the challenges and rationales behind like developing specifically for the iPad platform, but also being someone who's like writing one code base for everything, and also sort of at a meta level, like reflecting on the nature of like what even is iPad software to begin with. I don't know. That was a weird introduction, but let me just kind of go at these. So there's,
Sure.
and I hope I don't want any of these to come across as confrontational, but you can certainly accept them all as my +1s for future feature requests as well.
Oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, I already know what they are, of course. So, but I'm happy. I'm down. We can talk about it.
Sure.
It's no problem.
Well, I feel like I guess I'll bring up the thing that's like low as far as like someone who. How do I position this question? So, okay, I'll just go straight to it. So, the Apple Pencil is obviously like a device that Apple has like really heavily marketed as part of this. It's at least it's like part of the modularity of the iPad experience. It's certainly great for artists, but also like anyone can just pick it up and touch the iPad screen. Even if the iPad is asleep, you can start touching the pencil to the screen and it'll automatically from the lock screen open up an Apple Note and let you just start writing some text. So they're trying to sort of make this input method awesome and integrate it into the OS while also providing development tools to third parties where they can do cool stuff with the pencil as well. So there's sort of two layers to the pencil. There's like sort of just the generalized input, like using it like a finger, in which it can certainly be a very, very precise tool. But then there's also this sort of like other side to it, which is not what I expected from Dorico on the iPad, but I guess it's sort of an elephant in the room. Is like anyone who's listening is going to be wondering like, okay, there's definitely like iPad apps where you can like, do this right with the stylus on the staff and then watch it sort of like convert to notation before your eyes. And I would like to add a personal comment that while I think that this feature is super novel and cool and I like it and am optimistic about it on touch platforms, I did do some time tests of me using those kinds of apps and Dorico on iPad, and I'm like twice as fast in Dorico in every instance of all of my testing. I took about 10 excerpts from my own music library, things I would in practice actually need to put into one of these kinds of applications. And I think with like the pencil input, it's definitely like like when you're at the self-checkout lane, there's been like studies that say you move a lot slower, but you just feel more active. So there's this perception of like I'm moving faster, I have autonomy, I have control. Not to mention the fact that inputting notes with a computer keyboard, I'm always 100% sure that the note looks the way I intended it to, unless I messed up. But I think all that is worth sort of like putting into context. But also it's like, but it is this kind of like, the ideal is that it's this sort of futuristic tool, right? Like everyone wants to be able to directly manipulate the iPad with touch. And in the same way that a finger can do that, obviously in the real world, a pencil touched to a piece of paper, is another kind of metaphor that feels really good when translated to a screen. So I guess two elements, because there's like, I think it's probably different reasons why there's no handwriting recognition versus like why is the Apple Pencil not just a basic like finger simulator, right? Is that kind of two different rationales or?
Yeah, I mean, I think even if we were in the position where it was totally trivial for us to take full advantage of all the capabilities of the Apple Pencil in terms of, the stroke speed and angle and all that lovely stuff that Apple do indeed provide excellent APIs for. Even if we were in a position to do that, I still don't think we would choose to put handwriting recognition into Dorico. At least not right now. And the main reason for that is because it isn't fast enough. And in my experience, And I say this with great admiration and respect for the apps that are doing it. StaffPad, of course, being the leading one, but there's most of the other apps, certainly both Notion and Symphony Pro, offer in-app purchases of a sort of off-the-shelf handwriting library that's provided by a company called MyScript, who do and I've spoken to them many times over the years, including before I was here at Steinberg, and we've watched that technology evolve. But the truth is, music is way more complicated than it seems, right? And it's so easy for us to look at music notation and do all of that complicated pattern recognition stuff and all the rest of it, and we can interpret it very, very easily. And I think the real challenge is, like you say, how do you know you're being accurate enough in the way that you're describing the music as you're writing it by hand that the computer is going to interpret it correctly? And this is why we've got an on-screen keyboard, we've got an on-screen fretboard, we've got on-screen drum pads that are much closer to the analogues of how you actually make music than writing music on paper, right? That's always a secondary activity in the end, and unless you're one of those people who completely conceptualizes music, totally in your head. But normally, the way that you're going to experiment first with kind of getting the musical idea out into the world is by playing it on an instrument, or it's often going to be that way. And that does translate really well to a touch-based interface. I mean, it would be great if there was some kind of haptic feedback and some way of, kind of like feeling the keys on the screen so that you have something a bit more close to the experience of actually using a stringed instrument or a keyboard instrument or something. But, even with a flat piece of glass that you're just looking at, it's very, very close to the experience of doing that on a real instrument. And even though the Apple Pencil is it's a really unbelievably great analog for writing on paper. It's fantastic, and I have, again, I just think it's an amazing device, and I have one, stuck to the top of my iPad now, and I use it for various other things, but not writing music, because in the end, specifying the actual rhythm and the actual pitch that you want is always going to be quicker than asking the computer to interpret it. And that's even if we could, and I think even if it was perfect, even if the guessing was perfect, the interpretation was perfect, it's still going to take considerably longer for you to form all of those symbols, particularly, because again, it's a trade-off between how quickly you can write them and how well the computer can recognize them. And the quicker you go, unless you're superhuman, the more likely it is there's going to be so much looseness in the way that you're writing them that the algorithms are going to get tripped up. And so, we could spend a huge amount of time and money and research money on trying to solve that problem, and obviously companies like StaffPad have devoted years of research to get to the point where they are now, where it works really great for some people and not so great for other people. We can instead devote our time and attention to making input methods that will work first time, every time, for every user. That, to me, feels like a better use of our time. So that takes care of that half of the question. But then, more generally, like the Apple Pencil as a device for as for first class interaction tool on the iPad, I completely agree. And I think the main reason that we don't have support for the Apple Pencil at the moment is a boring technical one, basically, which is that because of the way that because we are, so we could sort of lay some of the blame at the door of the application framework we're using, Qt, but that isn't really fair, because Qt has actually had pretty good support for styluses, including the Apple Pencil, for a while. Really, it comes down to the practicalities of us taking our huge desktop app that we've been working on for 8 years and trying to squeeze it into the iPad in less than a year, right? In really only just over half a year. And there are obviously some trade-offs that we have to make along the way as we're doing that. And one of the areas of interaction that's quite complicated to get right is in the way that, if you've got something like our score view, the main music area with all the notes and things on it, and there are thousands and thousands of selectable items on there that you can interact with in different ways. You can highlight them, you can drag them, etc., etc., etc. And there's already quite a complex interaction model in Dorico that deals with doing that with the mouse. Because that's obviously that's what everybody's always been using since Dorico came out. And so then trying to kind of rework that in such a way that it still works. So using the same code, it still works exactly right with the mouse on the desktop, but it can also differentiate between the trackpad, the Magic Trackpad, which incidentally doesn't yet have great support, or indeed, as far as I know, any support in Qt. The finger and the stylus is very, very complicated and not something that we were basically able to tackle in the time that we have had to work on this first version. So I think that, my hope is that we will, the technology will continue to evolve. Our work, Dorico itself will continue to evolve. And so as we get the opportunity, as I say, it fundamentally changes or adds a new dimension to the way that we plan everything for Dorico from now on, having this app. And so, one of the things that we'll certainly be thinking about as we're looking at, reworking the main project window and so on is, how do we rework that in such a way that we can more easily accommodate the Apple Pencil, differentiate it correctly between the finger, between the trackpad, between the mouse and the pencil, and then do useful things with the ability to differentiate that. So I think that, I completely agree with you in terms of, the expectation that iPad users will have now, because Apple have done such a great job of building the pencil into the OS, and they continue to do that more and more each year. And, the new Quick Notes in Safari and iOS 15 and so on, these are all, tremendous and all the APIs are there if we can use them. But as you alluded to earlier on, one of the challenges that we have is that we're not using Apple's APIs in many cases completely directly. We can choose to do that where it makes sense, but we want, as far as we possibly can, to be building a cross-platform application. And so the balance is between an iPad native experience, whatever that means, and a Dorico native experience across all the platforms where Dorico runs. And so that's a balance that we have to strike as well, regardless of the technical sort of issues around what you can and can't easily do, when you're not using Apple's APIs directly. So I hope that kind of addresses both of those.
It very sufficiently addresses them, and probably in some respects addresses every other thing I'm going to bring up now. But I guess the stylus thing and, with using Qt as a development platform is interesting because, I know that, Windows, of course, has touch devices in their lineup, and it's just interesting to think. So I guess kind of what I'm reading in here is like, probably though as good as Apple Pencil APIs on iOS are, probably long-term investigating stylus support is going to probably be within the current development frameworks that you're using in order to sort of make sure that they're everywhere. Is that what I'm getting?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not even so much that they're everywhere, but just that, when it's an absolutely core part of the interaction, like the score view itself, that is always going to be, or at least I can't really at the moment foresee a time when that will be done through anything other than Qt, right? Because that is it. That's the brain, that's the guts, that's the heart of the operation. And although the core libraries that give rise to that are all totally platform agnostic, everything that's drawn on the screen, everything that you interact with, all the controls of that's all Qt. And so trying to kind of inject natively into that Apple's own APIs, I'm sure it's possible. The team are so clever, they can do anything, but it probably isn't the most practical way to approach it. And so if Qt can give us a pretty close match to the native APIs by themselves wrapping the native APIs. That's how these frameworks work, is that they abstract the platform-specific APIs and then wrap them in a cross-platform API. And that has obviously some benefits, because it means that we could then, for example, as you say, support stylus events on Surfaces and on iPads with the same code. That would be great. But it also might mean that some of the capabilities of, say, like the Surface has a button on its pen and the iPad Pencil doesn't. So, that means that then there could be some differences in terms of how Qt chooses to expose the capabilities of those two disparate platforms with a common API. And so that might mean that not everything that you can do with a particular input device is easy to do across every platform. And again, then we have to get into the issue of, well, what's more important to us? Is it more important to us that you get the same experience for using Dorico as far as possible across different platforms, or is it more important that you get the experience of the OS different platforms, and that's a balance that we have to kind of make on a case by case basis, being guided also by what's actually practical, because everything is possible with software given sufficient time and money, but that doesn't always mean that it's the right call to do.
Of course,
it.
right?
If you see what I mean.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Magic keyboard, which works super well for me in Dorico on iPad. The trackpad you did sort of a hint at. There's some things you want to add to it. The only thing that I can really notice that is sort of a widely adopted feature across document-based apps is that 2 fingers will scroll around the score. But I would imagine that you would address that similar to how you just addressed using the pencil as sort of like an input device. Like it's probably like something that you just have to figure out how to do with Qt and sort of bring everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I honestly, we have had so much to think about with getting the initial iPad version out the door that we haven't even really investigated that yet. We know that there's no specific API in Qt to do all those lovely things that you get in native apps, truly native apps, where you move the sort of the circular pointer, so to speak, I don't know what the official iPad term for it is, over a control, and it sort of does this beautiful animation where it then surrounds that control, and it's obviously highlighted in the same way that we're familiar with from, say, the Apple TV remote and so on. And that's a really delightful kind of way of it kind of really showing you the state of what you've got, and then you can also get things like tooltips and so on. All of that is probably going to be really, really hard for us to do, because that's all totally reliant on native controls, and it just depends. Again, it's not really going to be practical for us to rebuild. One of the main reasons that we have Dorico for iPad today is that we didn't have to completely rebuild its UI using platform-specific controls. That's one of the reasons why you're using it today. And if we had to do that on every platform, then we just simply don't have the manpower in our small team. There are fewer developers on Dorico than I have fingers. And that's to now develop software across 3 platforms, plus contribute towards other things that Steinberg are doing. Like we're playing right this minute, we're quite involved in the ongoing project to replace the e-licenser, which the much hated e-licenser with a new licensing system, and I'm involved in the user experience side of that. A couple of our programmers are actually doing some of the implementation work on that, and all of these things they all take time. So it is in the end it's going to have to be, as always, as this is kind of our job really, is to kind of balance all the opportunity costs of doing this versus doing that in something that hopefully has the right kind of mix of appeal to a wide range of people, and still making apps that look and feel good and native enough on the platforms they're on, and all these kinds of things. There's a heck of a lot to juggle.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. Okay, this is fun. This is like giving me some good insider perspective. And I'm sure other people too, because people just sort of expect things to work the way they want, and there's a reason for everything. So I like that we're kind of going through this. Multitasking and then file management were the other 2 that came to mind. And by multitasking, I'm referring to like splitting, basically putting it on half the screen. I would imagine it was a little unclear to me from some exchanges we had. Like, is that sort of by design or just something that needs to be investigated further?
Well, it's both. I mean, certainly for right now, one of the things that we've really, one of the things that's really been a challenge actually is, Dorico is a sophisticated app, and what we don't want is for it to feel overwhelmingly so when you're looking at it as a new user, and particularly because on the iPad you're missing some of the cues that you could use on the desktop version, like just hovering your mouse over something and seeing what that button is and so on. And Dorico for iPad has a heck of a lot of buttons on it, and hopefully they'll quickly start to make sense to people. But one of the things that becomes very tricky once you've got your iPad in split view and you've got, messages taking up a quarter of the width of the screen and so on, is that there's no room for those controls anymore. And although we've started to implement solutions for that by making certain UI elements scrollable or hiding certain things when there's not enough room and so on, that's a whole other set of challenges in terms of the user experience of the app, and making sure that, hang on, when I'm in split view and I've got mail over there or whatever it is, or I'm copying a PDF out of music or whatever it might be, but now these controls aren't there. That's a huge challenge in its own right. So, obviously what would be great is if we could find a way of making the UI, so minimal that there's nothing that you miss when these things are not shown. But again, this is version 1, effectively, of the iPad app, and so we'll find out from what people tell us about using the app. What are the things that work really well, and what are the things that don't work so well, and maybe we can find ways of moving things somewhere else. I mean, again, Apple's kind of trend is really to put more and more things behind disclosable elements in the UI, and that's definitely one way to kind of pare back the information that's shown to you as a user, but it also means that you need to know to look somewhere for something, and I feel like that's a challenge with a sophisticated document-based app. And obviously we looked at lots of document-based apps on the iPad to see how they're doing it, whether it's from Apple or Adobe or various different companies. And of course there's let a thousand flowers bloom in terms of the different ways that they approach it. But it was really important to us that we found a way of putting, if you didn't have a keyboard attached, putting all of those important features right there, particularly in write mode, so that you've got them. And so finding a way to do that while also making the UI sufficiently adaptable that it could accommodate being only 2/3 as wide or something. Even if you rotate your iPad into portrait mode, actually, things get a bit hairy in write mode. So I think there's definitely more work for us to do there as we learn more about how people are interacting with the app and what things are really important to them, and that will help us to kind of hone it, and then hopefully it'll be easier to support those sorts of things.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Cool. I have 2 listener questions. So I started a Patreon a couple of weeks ago, and I told supporters that I was interviewing you. Before I do that, I feel like I should cap this, and just say, like, is there anything that you would want someone to hear about? That we didn't cover about Dorico for iPad or Dorico in general, or yourself, where to find you, where to get more information about anything we've mentioned today, just anything that you wanted to say.
Yeah, let's do some of that stuff. Yeah, that is a good idea. So, obviously, thank you for asking me so many very detailed questions about Dorico for iPad. It's always fun to actually sort of get down to the nitty-gritty and talk about these things. But just to kind of recap, it's a free app. You can download it from the App Store. If you want to find out information about it, you can go to dorico.com/iPad. There you'll find a nice pretty page with lots of beautiful photos taken in Athens, as I mentioned much earlier on in our conversation, that show the app being used by some lovely people. You'll also find a short introductory video by my honey-voiced colleague Anthony Hughes, the voice of Dorico, who will take you through the main features of the app in just a couple of minutes. And you'll also find the button to download it from the App Store there. We'd love to hear your feedback on it. We really would. It's a brand new thing for us, and I'm hopeful that some of your listeners, Robbie, who maybe haven't tried Dorico on the desktop, will give the iPad version a try. I'd say also that we've tried to make the sort of learning curve as shallow as possible, and it will offer to show you some guided tutorials when you first start the app. You go through a few onboarding screens, you get to sign in and consider a subscription and so on. But once you do that, you'll get to the Learn page of the hub, and it will give you these 4 basic tutorials which will show you on the screen in a way that you can follow along and actually do those things yourself. The basic methods of inputting and editing notes and adding markings like dynamics and slurs and so on. It's worth just taking 10 minutes. That's all it'll take, but it's worth taking those 10 minutes to work through those and to get to sort of get a flavour of it. And once you've used the app and you've spent a bit of time with it, please do come to our forum and tell us what you think of it. You can find that at dorico.com/forum. That's also where you should come if you have a technical problem with the app. You'll find not only me and other members of the Dorico team, but also a very friendly community of fellow Dorico users there. And, we just really would love to hear what people are doing with it, how it's working for them, how we could make it better. I know that everybody's going to say, why can't I write on the score with my Apple Pencil or whatever it is? And that's great. We're totally happy to hear all of that stuff. But please do just come and tell us what you think of it. We really look forward to starting to have a conversation with people about what we've built and what we continue to build.
Awesome. All right. Well, if you are listening to this is the end of the conversation. So bye. I have to like record. So to those listening, if you want to listen to the rest of this conversation, these next 2 questions that I referred to a minute ago, you can certainly subscribe to my Patreon. It's a lovely place. I have lots of tiers of support, and you can come support me and at any level be part of the lovely Music Ed Tech Talk Discord server, where there's lots of lively discussion about teaching, pedagogy, music technology tools, all sorts of stuff. One of the tiers also includes a bootleg version of this show, which usually is early. This one will not be early, but it will include a little bit of extra stuff, which most of them do, because they are generally uncut versions of the episodes. So, join me if you want to hear some more from this conversation, but otherwise, see you later. I'll try to find a better way to elegantly end that for the regular.
See you later. Is that your normal sign off? Just see you later. Peace out.
Hope you enjoyed this conversation. My thanks to Daniel Spreadbury for coming on and being so transparent about development of Dorico. I'd like to encourage you to follow me on some places to stay up to date on my work. I've got a blog, musicedtechtalk.com. You can subscribe to it in a blog, reader app, or as an email newsletter. Please subscribe to this podcast. Give it 5 stars if you're using Apple Podcasts. That really, really helps. You can support me on Patreon, patreon.com/musicedtechtalk, where you can get access to my Discord server, where lots of music teachers get together and talk about technology, music education, pedagogy, and these kinds of topics. And you can get a bootleg version in one of the tiers of this very episode with some extended conversation with Daniel. I'm on Twitter and YouTube at Robbie Burns. Follow me there. I'm doing more videos. There's actually a video and a blog post that accompany this very podcast, so you can check them out there on my page. And then, of course, I'm on Twitch, Instagram, I'm on all of the places at either Robbie Burns or _Robbie Burns. So I hope to connect with you there. Be sure to check out my book, Digital Organization Tips for Music Teachers, and you can learn more about my teaching and music career at robbieburns.com. See you next time.